When I'm talking to a small business owner, it's up to them to create the company culture, to create the rules, the guidelines, the procedures. Whereas in a corporate role, that's likely set for you. That's set for you by your higher ups. My overall goal of what I do in my business is to bridge that gap between the flexibility of entrepreneurship and the structure of corporate.
You're tuned in to the Event Gems podcast, the podcast where coaches, consultants, and speakers learn how to produce transformational and profitable events. I'm your host, Natasha Wright, Chief Experience Curator at the Diamond Butterfly. Join me and other industry experts as we teach you how to maximize the power of your next brand building event. Time to drop those gems. Let's fly.
But before we dive into the episode, are you hosting your first event and feeling overwhelmed? I totally get it. That's exactly where I was when I was hosting my first event, which is why I created the Diamond in the Rough Event Host Guide to help you go from confusion to clarity. This guide comes with videos and worksheets to help you plan with confidence so you can focus on truly creating a memorable experience. Now let's dive into the episode. Welcome back to another episode of Event Gems. Welcome, Tatiana. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to dive into this conversation around leadership, building team, operations, all of those good things. Some of the things that I myself have struggled with in my own business journey. How did you go from a leadership background in corporate and transition to being a business owner? What has that transition been like for you?
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in people operations, how businesses work, how to have good company culture. Just thinking back to like my first jobs, like I was always the person who planned social events and would be thinking about employees' development and whatnot. And so it was natural to take on the job that I had right out of college, which was a district manager at Aldi, the grocery store. Prior to that, I actually interned for them for a summer as a district manager intern and learned a lot about the role and succeeded pretty well in the internship. And so they offered me a full-time position. And I worked as a district manager for almost 4 years. And in my time there, I just learned a lot about like people management, empowering your leaders to become leaders themselves. I managed 5 really high sales volume stores in the metro Atlanta area and was directly responsible for the 5 store managers and their respective teams. And so while I was there, I had to learn how to lead my managers so that I could teach them how to lead their teams. Because in the beginning, there was a lot of, the store managers are sitting on the register ringing up groceries because their team members aren't fast enough, or the store managers are, doing the truck in the morning because their team isn't fast enough. And so having to teach them how to properly train their team so that they can delegate, trust them to do their job so that the managers can actually sit in that leadership role. And that doesn't mean that they never help on the sales floor, right? That's a part of the job. Of course, you do that. But really being able to empower everyone to own their specific role. And so that was a really natural transition into starting my consulting company. I've always been an entrepreneur. I've always had different things going on, auto brokerages, vending machine companies, you name it. But I knew that I wanted to start consulting and making impact in companies. I just didn't know what that looked like. So when I first left my job in 2019, I was mostly teaching like in the startup environment, focusing more on like sales and marketing and stuff. And then I realized like, this isn't my thing at all. Like, I don't love this. So how do I take what I did in my corporate role and bring that over to my business? And that's when a light bulb kind of went off of like, hey, there's this really big gap in the industry where business owners are learning how to make money, how to market, how to get clients, but they're not necessarily being taught what to do when all of that works, right? Once the business takes off, then what? How do we hire people? How do we lead them the right way? How do we build a culture of efficiency and productivity, but also a culture where people want to work? So that's what got me here. And I spent the last 3 years really focused on like small business owners. And now I'm branching off and serving more corporations as well and working with like first-time people leaders. So I have those 2 industries that I work through. So the small business owner who needs to hire for the first time, build their team, but then also the seasoned corporation who has a team of leaders that aren't very well trained, and I come in and fill that gap.
Yeah, I love that you shared that. And I love that story of your transition. There really is that gap. There has been a flood of new business owners, especially women owned business owners, and a lot of business owners who are solo entrepreneurs. And so at a certain point, you need to transition as the business grows into bringing on new team members to support you. I know for me, I absolutely went through that, I think about 2 years ago, where I was getting so many clients and I did have contractors who supported me with different projects that I may have been working on. But as I was growing and bringing on new clients, number one, I wasn't sure how many clients it would take for me to break, right? To where things started to fall through the cracks, to where deadlines were being missed. And so I really had to take a step back and say, there were some of these services that I no longer want to provide, sort of go through like a pruning process, first of all, to get to a place where I felt like, all right, I could be a little bit more stable. I could breathe a little bit more, but I'm also working with clients and working on projects that I actually enjoy. And so to your point, from that back end perspective where people aren't seeing what's happening, I think that it needs to be a bit more emphasis on what's going on behind the scenes so that you can operationally grow in a way that's sustainable and so that you have a greater awareness of what that takes for you to grow sustainably. You talked about having two different clients. So you have the small business owner, you also have the corporate clients that you're working with. How different is it from a leadership perspective for those two groups of people in terms of leadership training? How is it different how a small business owner leads their team versus how a leader in a corporation would lead their team?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. On the
Mhm,
similarities side of things, learning how to empower people, how to delegate properly, how to communicate thoroughly and effectively, how to
mhm,
take and receive feedback. I think all those are very similar, even in the way that it's taught. But I think some of the major differences are, when I'm talking to a small business owner, it's up to them to create the company culture, to create the rules, the guidelines, the procedures. Whereas in a corporate role, that's likely set for you, right? That's set for you by your higher ups already. And so then it's about teaching them how to lead within the parameters that they've been given. Also, on the small business owner side, when you are leading your team to a certain goal point, right? We're trying to hit certain metrics or KPIs. We have the ability to be more flexible. We can change the metrics as we evolve. We can change what good looks like. But again, in a corporate environment, that can still change. But typically, the leader that I'm working with is a middle manager, first time people leader. They've never led a team before, so they're likely not in the C-suite or anything like that. And
mhm,
so again, they have those parameters. The goal point is the goal point. We just have to figure out how to get there. So yeah, I would say those are like some of the similarities and differences, but they're both awesome in their own ways. I enjoy working with both because I feel like what I learn through developing my small business clients helps me with my corporate clients and vice versa. So I think
mhm,
it's really beautiful, the relationship between the two. And my overall goal of what I do in my business is to bridge that gap between the flexibility of entrepreneurship and the structure of corporate. And so it's interesting, I used to be on the business owner side, teaching them how to incorporate more corporate type strategies within, the purview that fits. And now
mhm,
I'm on the other side as well, teaching my corporate clients how to bring in more of the autonomy that we experience in entrepreneurship. So I truly
mhm.
am kind of working as that bridge and relaying information back and forth to, each party.
One of the projects that I manage is a leadership program within a city for middle managers. When I hear some of the conversations that come out of that workshop, it's always so interesting to me because within the corporate structure, within a city or organization, there's not a lot of flexibility. And then within that, one of the things that I notice is that they have difficulty transitioning from being buddies. So you are working side by side, and then now you're their boss. How do you manage that transition? And so I think about even with entrepreneurs, sometimes we don't necessarily have that structure. We tend to have more of a buddy type relationship, even though we're the boss. And so you were talking about structure. So how do we deal with that? As a small business owner, you might just have a team of one or two people. So it's small enough where it's intimate enough, but you also don't want to be too buddy with the person to where results aren't happening. So how do we deal with that?
That's a great question. And I think that's something that a lot of business owners struggle with, especially when they are building like a much smaller team. And so I think there's a couple things that you can do, and it always comes back to that structure piece. I think there's nothing wrong with having a good working relationship with your team members, right? You can laugh and joke around on your meetings, your calls. You can catch up about how weekends were or what else may be going on in their life. And I think all of that's fine. But I think sometimes what lacks is the structure to keep us in line. And
Mhm,
so when there isn't that structure, our feelings tend to take us all over the place. And so a couple of examples of things that you could implement would be regular scheduled meetings that you use to check in on project progress or whatever might be relevant to the role of that person. But checking in on project progress, checking in on metrics and how we're performing in certain areas. So things like KPIs or, other goal indicators that you might have within your business. And then also, I think it's a really good idea to have a section of your meeting or a section of your check ins to reserve for the small talk, right? So typically in the beginning of our meetings, we're talking about our wins, our lessons, what's going on, anything else that we might want to discuss. And then we
mhm,
can get into the business. It's almost like having a code in a way, right? Hey, when we're here, we can cut up and have fun. When we're here, we're talking about business. And I
mhm,
think that's when business owners have the most success is when they can find that balance of having a great relationship with the people that they work with without compromising the results. And I'll admit it's a fine line. It's a fine line. But I think when everyone on the team is clear on their role, they're clear of what's expected of them, then you can have the personal relationship, but they still know that we fall back on this thing. But then the
mhm,
last thing I'll say is it's one thing to set it, right? It's one thing to say, here's what is expected. Here are your metrics. Here's how we work within this company, but it's our job as leaders to maintain that and uphold those expectations as well. Because
mhm.
if this person is late to work, well, a lot of us are working virtually. So let's say to meetings, right? They're
Yeah,
late to 10 meetings in a row and we don't say anything about it. It's
yeah.
like that silently agreeing thing, right? We're
Mhm.
allowing certain things to happen. So we have to maintain that expectation as we navigate through our relationship as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's ensuring that even though you have the flexibility to have a more informal relationship, you still need that structure and that balance, but also addressing any issues right away as opposed to letting it linger, investor further down the line, it becomes an even bigger issue. And so when you're talking about team members, that what I hear is be crystal clear on what their role is, their expectations are. So that's something that we should outline during the hiring process or once we're onboarding the person so that they understand what is expected of them. But also, if you do have that structure, that you also need to adhere to whatever the structure or the guidelines are that you have for your company. And so I think a part of that is really having difficult conversations, right? It's some people might be uncomfortable with it. I know that I have been in situations where I'm uncomfortable with it. And so I let it slide because I'm like, I don't want to, right? But what I'm realizing is that when you do like again, like I had mentioned before, the issue persists, and then you're not getting what it is that you need as a business owner from the team member, and the team member isn't getting what they need from you, right? In terms of like that structure. So how do you approach having difficult conversations? Is it just making sure that you have the structure and guidelines so at least you can always refer back to it? Or is it that you just gotta jump in and do it, right? Even if, regardless of whether or not you feel uncomfortable, this is something that needs to be done.
Yeah. Well, I think the recipe to having a successful, difficult conversation starts well before the conversation starts.
Mhm,
And to start, I'll tell a very, very quick story. So when I was in my district manager role, this was very early in my career. I mean, first 3 months of being a DM for sure, like right out of training. And there was a store associate who was allegedly always late to work. my store manager said, "Hey, I've talked to her about this 10 times. She's never on time. I'm tired of it. We need to let her go." So I come in, DM, and I say, "Okay, you say you've had these conversations with her. I'm looking at her time card. She's coming in 15, 20, 25 minutes late." So I sit her down and I let her go. So she feels blindsided. She gets very upset, says no one has ever talked to her about this. She ends up calling like the hotline or whatever, saying that she was wrongfully terminated. And so, of course, this response comes back to me. I sit down with my store manager. I'm like, "Hey, what's going on? You told me you talked to her. You told me you had these conversations with her." And he says, "Well, I mean, I mentioned it to her like on the sales floor. Like when she would come in, I'd be like, 'Hey, you you need to be on time,' or 'Hey, I noticed you were late today. Is everything okay?'" And this whole time I was under the impression that he was actually having formal sit downs in the office with her.
Mhm.
But not
Mhm.
only that, but when I looked at the time card of everyone else, everyone in the store was late. It wasn't just her. Like it was just a culture of lateness was okay.
Mhm.
And so that was a really good lesson for me early in my career because when you're having these difficult conversations, a lot of them can be avoided if we have the proper conversations up front, right? Sometimes the difficult conversation feels so big because we've been holding on to this thing that they did wrong for months, right?
Yeah.
Instead of having the conversation when it happens. So I would say the first step is to start having conversations as soon as you see a problem. And that doesn't mean that you need to nitpick your team, right? Or micromanage them, but just having conversations about the things that you're noticing, right? And almost having like a paper trail. And this paper trail isn't for just like legal purposes, right? The paper trail is to support you in your conversation, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of us don't have that. We don't have that past or prior documentation. And so when we get in to have the difficult conversation, we're leaning on our feelings. Well, I just
Mhm.
feel like you're not committed. I feel like you just don't care. I feel like you're not working as hard as you used to. And then when the team member says, "Well, give me an example, like, where is this coming from?" We draw a blank, right? And so really
Yeah.
beginning to, like, keep up with things as they're happening. But then I think, like, when you're in the conversation, right, it's leading with facts, not feelings, right? This is what's happening. This is where we are. This is what I've been seeing. And then giving them the opportunity to share their perspectives. Maybe they have a reason why their work performance has been poor or why they haven't been showing up to things on time or whatever the thing is, right? Give them the opportunity to share. And then I think from that point, it's about collaborating on a solution. How do we want to move forward? What does it look like to be past this, right? Like if right now we're not doing great, right? We're not on a good
Mhm.
track to promotion or even staying employed with me, what does it look like to be on the other side of this? Like really painting that picture. And then the
Yeah.
two of you collaborating on how we get there. Of course, letting the team member lead the charge, but letting them know that we're there to support them. I think sometimes when a team member is in trouble or they're not doing well, we want them to take initiative and just like take ownership, which is true. But we do still have to show that we're there to support them and like lead them or guide them through getting to that
Mhm.
next step.
Mhm.
And then I think lastly is like setting a follow-up date to talk again. So if today is January 1st and we're having this conversation, let's circle back on February 1st and see where we're at, right? And if
Mhm.
this the first time you're having that conversation, then February 1st comes around, you're hopefully on a better note and you're good to go. But if this is maybe the third conversation, then maybe on February 1st, we're reevaluating if this role is still a good fit for that person. I could go on and on and on, so I will stop there.
I'm thinking about even someone who I had hired previously, and it was that type of like I would say something, but it wasn't anything, or I would correct the behavior or provide feedback, but it wasn't anything that was formalized, or there wasn't a follow up date for then when this would be reevaluated. And so we just continued on, right, until it really got to a place for me where I had to say, okay, this is not working anymore. This is not it. But I think that if I did have those checkpoints, then it would be a gradual situation where now a month later, here's this checkpoint. Nothing has really changed. So I'm already conditioning myself for what is the next step as opposed to not having that. And then it's however many months later. And then I'm just like frustrated. So when we're talking about hiring,
So I was listening to, or I watched one of the videos that you did on Teen Talk on your
Mhm.
Instagram page. I really love those series, by the way. I think it was one of the first persons that sent you a question. And I believe they were a first time business owner. They weren't financially in a place to hire a team yet. And so you provided some feedback on what are some of the things that they could do. So I wanted you to talk about who are some of the first people that you, in your opinion, that business owners should hire if they do have the funds to hire someone, or
Mhm.
some of the other alternatives for bringing on someone full time, but also for someone who is now able to bring on someone full time. What are some things that they need to be mindful of in the hiring process, or some of the mistakes that business owners make when they're hiring someone full time?
Yeah. So I think if you're not in a place yet where you can hire, but you're starting to think like, what would that person even be? Because one, you need to be thinking about that, right? Sometimes when we don't think about that ahead of time, I think when we have the money to hire, we just jump in and hire the first person we find. So for business owners who don't yet have that figured out, and you're wondering like, what would that first role be? I think a lot of times our default is a virtual assistant, and I think in a lot of cases, a virtual assistant can be great. But what I want you to think about is what role can I hire, or what type of support can I get that's going to help me increase my revenue? I think that should always be the first hire, someone who's going to directly affect that. And so that might look like someone to support your clients. So if you are running an agency that does design, it might be hiring another designer, because that is gonna support you to allow you to bring on more clients, right? That's gonna allow you to increase your capacity. Or if you are someone who is in a role where you do corporate consulting, it might be another consultant. It might be a salesperson for your consulting, so on and so forth, right? And the reason why I didn't list a virtual assistant is because, again, I do think some people are going to need that first. And I think, your workload load will kind of tell that story. But a lot of times we're told to hire out that low hanging fruit. And what happens is we hire out the low hanging fruit. We hire someone to, manage our emails and, uh, you know, put things on our Pinterest board and, so on and
Mhm.
so forth. And we have that money going out the door every month, right? We're paying that in payroll, but we're not
Mhm.
necessarily seeing time savings. We're not
Yeah.
necessarily seeing financial gain from hiring that person. And I think that's where business owners start to get jaded about hiring, because they start
Mhm.
to think like, I could just do this by myself. Because the truth
Mhm.
is, at that early of a stage, you probably could do it by yourself. If you
True.
don't have the finances to hire someone, then you probably don't have enough emails that you need someone to then manage those emails, right? I don't
Mhm.
think you need someone to manage your emails until you're, really starting to generate some serious income in your business. And if you do, then that's when I think newer business owners should fall back on systems, automations, that kind of thing to support them and cutting down on that administrative workload. Now, when thinking about like some of the mistakes that people make in hiring when they do start to make those decisions, I would say the first one is definitely hiring based off of feeling and emotion. And so
True.
that can look two different ways. That can look like hiring the wrong role because you just feel like you need help. So you just jump in to hire a VA, or you just jump in to hire a social media manager. But that can also look like hiring the first person that applies to work with you because you are just desperate to get some help in
Mhm.
the door.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
I've been there. Where it's like the workload feels so heavy. It's like, I need someone. I
yeah,
need someone to help. And so you just
yeah.
you're like, okay, this person feels like a good fit. Let's go ahead with you. Yeah.
And you know what too? Like, I don't think that's horrible, right? I think
Mhm.
there are times where, we never wanna have a Band-Aid fix, but sometimes it feels like I just need a Band-Aid for
Yes,
a
that's
couple
exactly
months.
it. Yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh. Mhm.
But I think, like, when we're really starting to think about that long-term strategy, and I think that kinda brings me to my second point, which is really starting to look at your business as a whole, looking at your vision for the company, your long game, right? The long game that you're playing, and asking yourself, "What type of team do I need to get here? And once I'm here, what type of team do I need to sustain that?" And what
Mhm.
that's gonna do is help you to build more of, like, an organizational structure, right? You have 4 roles that you wanna hire for over the next 2 years. This is what they're gonna look like. This is who's gonna report to who. And when you do that, the team starts to feel more strategic versus
Mhm.
the opposite is instead of thinking about the long game, we're just thinking, what do I need right here, right now? And when you
Mhm.
do that, you end up looking up 2 years from now, you've hired 8 contractors, you're paying tons of money, and you're still doing a lot of the work because the
Mhm.
team, when you take a step back and look at the big picture of the whole team, it doesn't make sense. They don't really mesh well
Mhm.
together. You have 3
Mhm.
people doing the same work, you just don't realize it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
really starting to look at the strategy, more holistically.
I'm thinking about clients whose teams I've been a part of, thinking about my own team members that I work with, and realizing that within this whole conversation, it's really around planning for the future. So whether you are a solo entrepreneur, you're thinking about hiring, you know that at some point your business is going to grow, you still have to start thinking about these things beforehand. And even if have a smaller team, it's thinking about, well, what does it look like 5 years from now? Who are those team members that I need to bring on? And my coach is Brittany Janine. She's actually the one who put me on to you. And that's how I started following you on social media. But one of the things when I went through her program, she had us put together I'm trying to think. What was it called? It was like a CEO headquarters, basically, in Google Drive. And so each within the headquarters, right, we had our different departments. So you had your marketing, your operations, your accounting, like all of those things. So that's where you'll have all your documents live. And so even though I don't necessarily have a marketing department, right, I still have in my mind that I have a marketing department. And so at some future point in time, as my business grows, at least all of those things are there, things I've worked on, it lives in there. And so it's
Yeah.
really thinking about, like from when I'm hearing you say, is thinking about what is the future of your business and how can you operationalize it right now, even if you're a solopreneur, even if you have a small team. And so I'm just thinking about my wheels are turning for my own self.
Good.
Right? Right. And then also it's also just thinking about other teams that I'm a part of. And so one of the reasons why, even though for the most part, the conversations here are about events, I really wanted to bring on someone who could talk about leadership and team building. Because with working with events, there are a lot of different team members that come together, contractors, collaborators who come together in order for us to make this event happen, right? And I've been a part of teams where they don't work well together. And even though we might all be contractors, so you're dealing with your own team as a business owner, but you're also dealing with a team within the project. So how do you, that's within a project, to move that project forward? So as a business owner, if you are a part of a team like that is moving the project forward, how do you suggest that we deal with conflicts within that larger?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to clarify, so are you saying everyone on this team is of equal level, or are you the leader of this team that you're working
So you might have someone and the client would be the leader, right?
with?
And
Right.
then maybe the project manager is the second person, and then you have all the other contractors.
Yeah. Well, I actually work with event-based companies a lot.
Mhm.
Somehow that's becoming like my biggest niche within like the small
Really?
business things. Yeah.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
I spoke at the Signature CEO conference, in
Yeah.
DC a couple years ago, and then spoke at it again this year. And ever since, like, I've just been meeting so many people in the event industry, so that's,
Mhm.
interesting. But, so a couple things. One, I think when you're working on a team of contractors, especially if it's, like, freelance style, right? Like, you were
Mhm.
called just to work this specific event. I
Mhm.
think the challenge comes in because this team doesn't have rapport together. They've just
Mhm.
been compiled together for this one day or this one weekend or this one event. And
Mhm.
so I think the first thing is like we have to establish some common ground, right? What do you like to do? What do you not like to do? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? How do you communicate? How do you feel empowered? What feels disempowering to you? And I think it's the leader, the project manager, it's their job to kind of identify those things, but then
Mhm.
also to create like some camaraderie between the group as well. So maybe, the first time everyone meets might not need to be on event day. Maybe that looks like having a meeting or powwow ahead of time, right? whether it's in person or over Zoom, just giving the team a chance to get to know each other. And then going through like the run through of the day, right? Like what is the day going to look like? Who's doing what job? If Susie, who's over here doing, you know, PA type work needs help, who does she call, right? If Bobby, who is the runner, who's running from, job to job to just support as needed, who does he call if he needs help? I think a lot of the frustration in these types of environments tends to happen when there's confusion, when people feel like, so and so is not pulling their weight,
Yeah.
or when they don't know what's going on, right? When there's that lack of communication. And so it's a lot harder to remedy it in the moment. So I think you're better off as the leader of this group or as a member of this group working on these things ahead of time, right? Before we even kind of get to the job site. But then also I think there needs to be some sort of like routine or a thing that we do on the day of if there is a tiff of some sort. If something is going on, what is that one thing that we do that's going to reset the room? Is it a magic word? Is it a, hey, let's call an audible? Hey, let's do a team huddle? Something to reset the energy in the room really quickly because you need that, right? So that we can refocus on the goal and get back to work. I think about it like a football game, right? We're going to call it timeout. We need to talk. We talked about this play we're going to run and we're not doing it the way we thought we were. So let's
Yeah.
huddle up. Let's figure out what the problem is and let's get back on track to where we're supposed to be. And then, you see teams win the game after that. And so I think it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you share that. And so I'd like to just circulate back to what you just shared to some of the things that the audience might also be dealing with, right? So if you're someone who you're hosting your own events, like what you just shared is super important. Is it that even if you do have contractors, even if you do have volunteers, having that point of contact with everyone beforehand so it doesn't become a situation where everybody's meeting everyone on game day, essentially. It's like that warm up, like having those conversations beforehand. And so one of the things is at least bringing everyone on a call or bringing your volunteers on a call. If you're just having volunteers and you're not able to hire contractors per se, but having like the volunteers maybe going through a checklist for the volunteers or what it is that their roles or responsibilities are. So everyone is clear as to what those things are so that when it comes game day, you don't have people crossing over into other people's territory that they think is their territory. And the other thing that you share, I think is so great is having that team meeting even on site. So if you're having an event and you're on site, maybe you have that team huddle in the morning if it's a one-day event, but then also doing some type of debrief the day of after the event so that whatever feedback people have is fresh in their mind. So yeah, I think it's definitely a great way for you to build the team camaraderie, right? If everyone comes together beforehand and you see the totality of how important each person's role is to the success of the project, then I think that it allows for people to say, all right, let's move in unison to achieve this goal, which is to create an amazing experience for the attendees and so on. Go ahead.
Real quick, if I could just add something. Also, something that comes to mind when you're saying that is I think anyone who works in the event industry has had that one event where they just feel like everything went wrong.
Yes.
Like everything just fell through the floor as soon as we stepped in the venue to get set up. And I actually had this happen with one of my clients in the event industry as well. Like, just felt like, hey, these last 2 events we've had were just horrible, like from start to finish. And I think a lot of times we have the opportunity to save it. We have the opportunity to reset the energy in the room, right? And it's up to us to do that, right? And so if we are 2 hours into a setup that's supposed to take 4 hours, and again, it feels like everything is going wrong, everyone's moving too slow, the curtains have a stain on them, this delivery didn't get here in time, we can have that time, call a timeout, get together and regroup, right? Sometimes if you had these 3 people assigned to this one thing, it might mean that we have to break them up, right? We might need to re-strategize what the game plan is here live in the moment, but we have the opportunity to turn it around. So if you feel like things aren't going well, ask yourself, why is it not going well? Get the team together and figure out how can we redirect this thing? Because maybe it's not going to go from being horrible to being the best event ever, but it might go from being horrible to pretty good, right? And if nothing else, the team is going to grow massively as a result, because now they're going to feel more confident in their ability to pivot and to strategize and to come up with solutions instead of just kind of sitting in the problem so much. So
Mhm,
just to add
mhm.
that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. As you're talking about that, the word that comes to mind is operationalizing. Is operationalizing the business. Is before we wrap up this conversation, is there any consideration that business owners need to think about as they're moving through this process of growth? Because I do believe that we're growing, right? As business owners, growing and scaling. What are some things that we need to be thinking about or operationalizing as we get to that next level within our business?
Yeah. I think I could sit here and I could talk about SOPs and how you need to have,
Yeah.
all of your processes documented, but you've probably heard that before. And so
Yeah.
I think what I want to talk about or focus on is operationalizing the way that you deliver your products and services to your
Mhm.
client. If you can master that, it is going to be 10 times easier to bring other people in to do it, right? And so yes, a part of that is SOPs,
So, right?
but really that's the end. SOP, standard operating procedure, that's when you're documenting the process that already works. But so many
Mhm.
business owners are forgetting the beginning part, right? Does the process work? Is the
Yeah.
process efficient? Does this process matter? Is it necessary? Is it something that we're wasting our time on? Or is it something that's actually affecting the business in a positive way? And so if we can spend time writing out our process A to Z and then going through it and identifying, well, where are the gaps, right?
Mhm.
We need to make sure that there is someone assigned to each part of the process, A through Z. And right now, if you're the only person on your team, then guess what? It's probably
You
you,
do. All
right?
right.
Uh, but maybe there's automations that are in play. There are different steps that we might be missing. And I think like common examples of that might be, okay, we have the sales call. The client says yes. We send them the onboarding paperwork. They book their kickoff call or their, event design call, right? But then maybe there's a lull right there. Well, what happens after the call? Like, do I immediately jump in and start the design? Like, am I missing something? I think that's another one too, right? A
Mhm.
lot of times we're missing information from our client. We don't have what we need to move forward. And so, really going through your process with a fine tooth comb and asking yourself, does this make sense? Do I need
Yeah.
to change something, right? Am I having too many calls with my clients? Am I not, getting
Ooh,
enough
I know
one-on-one
that question
time?
also.
Do I need to schedule an on-site with my client? Would it
Yeah.
be more effective to schedule a 1-hour design call instead of 5 15-minute check-in calls, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
thinking through that so that when you bring people in, because guess what? Hiring people is just going to amplify what's already happening. So if it's
Mm.
already kind of a cluster, right? If it's already
Yeah.
really unorganized and you bring
Yeah.
in more people, it's just going to be way more unorganized. It's going to stress
Yeah.
you out even more. So yes, you need an SOP. You need to document your process. But first, you need to make sure the process makes sense to begin with.
Make sure the process makes sense to begin with and that you're not adding in additional steps that don't even need to be there.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I have a tendency to overwork myself. Maybe I just love it. I just love it so much. And so to go through that and say, do I need to do this? Is it something that is important? Is it something that I could take away? Is it something that, like you said, that I could find an automation to do as opposed to me manually doing that step myself and adding more to my plate or adding more to a contractor's plate? And then the other part of what I heard is also that you having that process for delivery to clients is also going to allow you to scale and scale in a way that is more sustainable. Because if you productize that offering that you have for your clients, then it becomes an easier lift client after client for you to keep moving forward. And so just making sure that each one of the steps leading up to that end product for the client is not only documented, but streamlined is what I hear you saying. So that's definitely something that we all need to be thinking about as we grow and we scale our business and create less friction in the process for not only for ourselves, but for the clients that we're working with, right? So thank you so much, Tatiana. This was an amazing conversation, a rich conversation, got my wheels turning on things that I need to be working on. And I hope that for you as a listener, that you're really taking in some of the advice, some of the tips, some of the strategies that will help you to not only be a more effective leader, but also create a business that is more sustainable with team members who are the right fit for your organization and growing company. But before we close out the conversation, what is one last gem that you'd like to leave the listeners with? That could be business related, personal, it doesn't matter, but just one last gem.
Yeah, I think if you're a business owner who has not yet built a team for one reason or another, you don't need a team to do what you want to do in your business, right? You absolutely do not have to hire anyone. But the journey is way more fulfilling and it's way more streamlined and effective when you have support. And so for some people, that might mean I need 10 people because I'm trying to build a multi-million dollar company. But for a lot of people, one, two, sometimes even three team members can absolutely change your life. It can change the way that you run your business. It can change your work-life balance. It can change so much. And so don't be closed off to the idea because you don't know how to do it or because you've heard someone else's bad experience with it or because you're afraid to make the investment. You need to wait until it makes sense financially for you to do that. But when you have the means to do it, there are so many tools and resources out here. I provide tons of them for you to be able to do this with confidence. I've seen business owners go from being, a one-man show, Jack or Jill of all trades. Impact is severely limited because there's only so much you can do by yourself to being able to reach internationally with their company, right? To being able to take 1, 2, 3 week vacations to working with dream clients that they never had capacity to work with before. And so there's so much on that other side of the fear that we have right now, right? So that would be my closing advice is just don't be closed off to the idea and know that it can absolutely take you way further in your business and it can look however you want it to look. You don't have to have the same team that someone else has. You don't have to have $20,000 a month in payroll, right? No one is telling you that you need to do that. And a little can go a long way when you do it with strategy and when you really put some thought into how this team is going to play into the end game, the long-term goal that you have for your company.
Yeah, 100%. Looking at your business holistically, seeing where is the right fit for the team member or the first person that you might need to bring on or the next team member that you need to bring on. Don't just go out there and hire. Hire strategically. So thank you so much for sharing that information. Thank you so much for being here on Event Gems podcast. We're going to be linking your website, social media handles, everything in the show notes. And so you can connect with Tatiana there. Any closing words, Tatiana?
No, I think that's it. If you need some support with, anything team related, we have an incredible shop called Grindaholics RX. It's kind of like our play on a digital pharmacy where business owners can go and get the very specific solutions that they need. All of our products are very easy to implement within 48 hours or less. So things from, how do I set up my hiring, training, and onboarding, all the way to how do I identify the vision that I have for my life and for my business. So definitely check that out. But I look forward to connecting with you, via DM or whatever. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So if you enjoyed this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe to the Event Gems podcast. Until next time, I hope you caught those gems now. Let's fly.